everybody knows that there's a problem with race and the criminal justice system, but what's the point in having this conversation? And I don't know if anybody's sort of noticed the news recently, but we've been having a lot of conversations about race in the context of the Democratic primary, have we not?
Yes.
And one of the things that is in the experience of most African American people that I know is that when a bad crime is reported, there's this moment where people sort of clench and just say to themselves, God, I hope he's not black. Does anybody kind of know what I'm talking about here?
Yes.
And the reason for that is that one of the things that we do in this society is we imbue every member of, in particular, the African American members of our society, with the bad acts of every African American. And that's part of what happens when I'm picking a jury. I'm sitting next to somebody that, first of all, nobody presumes innocence to start with, right? I mean, when you read in the newspapers that so-and-so was arrested for X or Y awful crime, do you say to yourself, but I presume I'm innocent? No. You just say, thank God they got the guy, and I can relax now because whoever it is who is going out shooting people or whatever is behind bars because, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. The police wouldn't arrest somebody who didn't do it, et cetera, right? I mean, that's kind of our instinctive reaction. If you add that with all of the juror stories or ideas that they have about African American people and Hispanic people, when you walk into a jury room, you are already dealing with an overwhelmingly stacked case against your client before a word has been spoken, before a single witness has talked, before anyone's been cross-examined. There's just a presumption of guilt and evilness that you are dealing with just right from the beginning without anything else having happened. And part of it is that those are the stories that we hear. And we hear them because they're easy to tell, and they distract us from the real problems in our society, like, you know, kids that are hungry and schools that have no books and neighborhoods that are, you know, overwhelmingly poisoned by lead and all the other kinds of things that actually take more than 3 seconds to say and in which you don't have a bad guy and a good guy. Amnesty International have been trying to get onto death row for years, but unable to do it. The John Howard Association, unable to do it. The UN Commission, unable to do it. But Oprah is a different matter. So she managed to get right onto death row, and she was right after the governor had commuted all the sentences, and she talked to people that were on death row, and she said during one of these breaks that she was surprised to learn that the people on death row were actually people. She had not thought of them as anything other than the act for which they were on death row for. I found this startling and frightening. And it is part of what happens in the media is we tell such stupid, one-dimensional stories that we end up with very one-dimensional view of the world. And of course, people on death row are people, some of whom done awful things, some people who haven't done anything at all. People were laughing at me when I was representing death row inmates in the state of Illinois, and I was saying they're innocent people on death row, but they're not laughing now. You know, and don't get me started about Texas or Louisiana.
I would look for almost any explanation besides the media. If you think that if as you say, attitudes are truly changing, I do a little deeper polling, frankly, before I was convinced that attitudes have changed, because I think at the bottom of much of this is what I call the puritanical urge. There is this deep-seated kind of Protestant belief that the world is, in fact, the universe is divided into good and evil, and that being on the right side of that is much of what life is all about, and that for those who are on the wrong side of the divide of good and evil, there's almost no punishment that's good enough or great enough, and thus you find this urge to punish. And I've discovered it not just in what I've seen in the world, but a lot of it comes from what I hear from the readers of the Daily News. I mean, there are people who, if you don't have a clear-cut, almost one-dimensional case of actual innocence in every dimension, not just innocent of the crime for which someone was convicted, but innocent of never sending in a late library book, paying their taxes on time, being nice to their mother, and everything else, in every dimension, unless you meet that actual test. And even sometimes when you do, there's this hardcore belief that, I mean, look, you see much of it in the Sean Bell case and the reaction to it. There are people who have said, they said it in court, they said it on television, they've said it to me many, many times. They're like, oh, those guys were up to no good. And it doesn't matter if you tell them that there was no crime committed that night by anyone. There was no drugs, there was no prostitution, there was not even outstanding warrants, nobody in the club. And there's still this sense of, well, they didn't do this, but they did something in the past, so he got what was coming to him. And that really is, I think, the standard against which it's not so much a question of telling a better story in a lot of cases, but in deciding what story to tell, over what period of time, and in what depth. It is possible to tell, again, sort of the exoneration story, the 60 Minutes exoneration story. It crops up every couple of years. Actual innocence, clear wrongdoing, clear defects in the process, and everybody understands what should happen from there. But that's really just the flip side of the same morality tale. The much more difficult story to tell is one in which nobody's all good, nobody's all bad. The ideal of justice is most needed, in fact, when someone is not pure as the driven snow. I mean, everybody needs mercy, but people who have done something wrong really need mercy and understanding and compassion. And those values are, I think, what gets bled out of the story in most cases.
We don't look to context in the media to determine causation. We look at this man who committed this crime, and this crime was awful, and he was sentenced to death. And we abstract out all of these decision-making, these moments that happened along the way. And then a related thing is that we don't go from these specific circumstances of injustice when they occur to more general issues that occur every day. So in terms of talking about the individual things that the media is bad at doing, well, there's an individual case. It's a death penalty case, and what are the people going to look at? They're going to look at the crime. There's a limited range of things that we're going to discuss, and the things we won't discuss are who didn't get the death penalty for similar crimes. We won't discuss what victims lead to the death penalty or not to the death penalty, and then we won't discuss who made decisions along the way to end up at this moment. Those questions are more abstract, and I think they're sort of distant to the minds of people who are in the daily grind of reporting on these cases. That might be a little bit different than like Anita Totenberg, but certainly in the daily sort of discussion of these issues, those aren't really on the table.
Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a professor at Stanford, who's doing really interesting work on how racial bias influences the criminal justice process. She's done one study where she finds that if you look at the face, she went to a database of defendants in Philadelphia who had been accused of capital crimes. And some of them had been sentenced to death. They'd all been convicted. Some of them had been sentenced to death, and some of them had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. And she looked to see whether there was anything about the looks of these guys that could help you predict who got death and who was spared. And she had the pictures of these all black defendants rated by people who didn't know what she was doing for how African they looked, how stereotypically African American did these guys look. And overwhelmingly, if you looked stereotypically African American, you were getting the death penalty. So the faces of these guys had a huge impact on whether they were going to be spared or sentenced to death.